Well, I'm Edwin Ellis. I'm a professor at the University of Alabama, and I'm the author of the Make Sense Strategies Toolkit. And in these series of videos, we're going to be looking at the 9-12 Common Core Language Arts standards and various ways you can use the Make Sense strategies when addressing those standards. And so primarily we're going to be looking at a variety of samples of how teachers have used different think sheets to address those standards. In part one, we're going to be focusing on the reading standards, and then in part two, we're going to be focusing on the writing standards. So to get started, what I'm going to do is just provide a brief overview of how the standards are set up, and then we'll look at some samples. So in the area of reading literature, there are three main categories of standards: key ideas and details, craft and structure, and integration of knowledge and ideas. Now, each of those categories has a series of strands of standards, and the first one deals with being able to differentiate between explicit text and inferences about the text, determining the theme and central idea, and how plot unfolds and is propelled. Likewise, with craft and structure, there's how text structure contributes to meaning, point of view, comparing variances with literature, and comparing genres. So in terms of explicit text versus inferences, what I'm going to do is share with you some samples of various smart sheets from the software to illustrate how you can address some of these standards. So for an example, one of the standards, the 9-12, is cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support analysis of what a text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text, including determining where the text leaves matters uncertain. So I'm going to share some of that with you and how you can address some of these. Now, this is the home page of the Make Sense Strategy software, and there are a series of smart sheets that are generic in nature that deal with hierarchical, compare and contrast, cause and effect, and sequence. And then there's a series of topic-specific smart visuals that focus on essential understandings. And so the area of literature has just a wealth of resources in it that may be helpful to you. And so I'm going to click on character analysis, and that will open this page. Now, one thing you'll notice right away is a lot of these are for little kids because this is K-12 material. And however, as we move down and into other pages of this, they get more sophisticated. So for an example, if I click on this one, which are the character features, then you have these prompts like appearance, how the character looks, self-perception, what the character thinks about his or herself, perceptions of others, and so forth. And so this is one of the smart sheets that I would use that focuses on what the text says explicitly. And here's an example of it in terms of Huck Finn. And then you can also click on page 2 of character analysis, and there's another one here that I think might be useful to you, and that's called the character clear table. And so with this one, you have prompts like you have the characters important in the story because, ways to describe the character, what was the character's role in the story, who would be an opposite character or don't confuse this character with, how are the character changed in the story, and somebody from today's world this character's like or not like because, and this character makes you think of because. And so here's an example of how that would be applied to Scrooge, of course the main character in Christmas Carol. Now I'm going to be kind of going through these samples rather quickly, so you probably won't have an opportunity to read all of the things that students or teachers have written on these. But you do have a handout, and so if you want to look at these samples more carefully, you can find them there. You can also pause the video if you want an opportunity to look at them on screen. In addition to that, all of the samples that I'm sharing with you here are also on the software, and I can show you later where to find those. So I realize that you're not being given an opportunity to take the time to really study each of these samples. I just want to give you a sense of what's on here and how teachers have used them. So getting back to the main page of the software, another area that you might want to check out is literary analysis. And so again, we're looking at what the text says explicitly. And one of the things you might find helpful is this poem analysis. And so the way this set is set up is you have a speaker. Who's the speaker? Who's reading the poem? Who's the speaker? Implied purpose. What's the underlying message? Personification. The objects or things in the poem represent other stuff and how. An analogy. Is the speaker comparing things or saying what something is like and how? And theme. What's the message about life? So this is really a combination of explicit and inferences that are being addressed here. And here's an example of how that might look in terms of the poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. In terms specifically going after inferences, there's a couple of, there's several resources here that could be useful, and a simple one is up here in the hierarchic category, and these are generic graphic organizers. So they don't have specific prompts related to literature, but we're going to look at the two main idea ones for a second. And so all of these visuals reflect graphic organizers all depicting two main ideas and supporting details in one form or another. And so I'm going to click on flowchart to give you an example of how this might be used or set up. So we're looking at what the text says explicitly as well as inferences. So for an example, let's say we're reading Fahrenheit 451, and this is the gist. We're talking about Montag. And what we know from the book about Montag, and these would be what the book says it explicitly. And these are inferences about Montag, what the book doesn't reveal but might be true. And so when I'm using this with students, we might be reading Fahrenheit 451 and discussing and identifying from the book specific information here, and then speculating what else might be true but the book doesn't actually say. Another one you can use is the three main idea one, and the three main idea frame is pretty good for this, and let me share with you how this would be set up. So now we have what the text says explicitly as well as inferences, plus determining where the text leaves matters uncertain. So here's how I would use this. Again, Fahrenheit 451, and we're talking about Montag again, and so one of the things is what we know from the text about Montag, inferences about Montag, and what the text leaves uncertain about Montag. Why he became a fireman, whether he feels guilty about burning books, whether Montag is willing to go out on a limb to change things, if he's using Clarice as a model for the person he wants to be, and so forth. And of course at the bottom there's so what's important to understand about this. So what the author leaves uncertain in the story can be as important to the story as the information actually provided. To look at a different area, for an example, determining the theme or central idea of literature. Here's an example of one of those standards. And so there are a variety of tools from the Make Sense that will be helpful for that. One of the things I'm going to illustrate to begin with is a four main idea, and we're going to select the side idea graphic for that. And so the way it's set up is you have a topic and is about, and then main ideas and supporting points, and a so what at the bottom. Well, here's how I would use that for theme analysis. Now this is an example of looking at themes in the King Arthur stories. And so there are four basic themes found in all King Arthur stories, like there's always some kind of challenge, some kind of quest, enchantment, and there's always a promise required by the chivalry code. And then we can look at how that shows up in books like, or stories like Robin Hood and so forth. Now, what's important to understand is that most of the time students are not going to know what these themes are. And so initially when you're doing theme analysis, it's always important to go ahead and provide the themes for the students or the primary topics of the stories, and then use that as a basis for looking for evidence of how those show up. But we don't expect students to actually come up and identify these specific types of themes, at least early on. Another tool that you can use for theme analysis, if you click on literary analysis, it will open this page, and then if you click on literary themes, what will open looks like this. And so what I've done here is gone through and identified what are the most common themes that appear in literature. And certainly this is not all the themes by a long stretch of the imagination, but they are some of the most common ones. And so the idea is if you can familiarize your students with what these themes are basically about, and some of them are pretty self-explanatory, like the price of love or the triumph of good over evil, but if they're familiar with the meaning of these themes in general, and you have a list of them, then it's much easier for a student to then read a story and pick out what is probably the theme of the story based on the list here. And so they can pick one of these, or if they think of a different one, they can add it here. And so the way this works is you select a theme, and sometimes there are multiple themes, and then what is evidence of the theme in the story, and this might be a quote or a particular passage, and then you explain why you think this evidence supports a particular theme that was selected. So here's an example of that. This is across 5 Aprils, and the theme of that is the price of war and peace. And evidence in the story, for an example, is when the cousins visit from the south and they talk about war with the Creightons. And then the Creightons, as a family living in southern Illinois, don't want war, they don't wish for it, so most of the family members support the north while the relatives are supporting the south. And so this goes on and sort of explains other evidences of this theme, price of war and peace. Another tool you can use is up here under the hierarchic category, 4 main ideas. So if I click on that, these are all smart visuals that address 4 main ideas in one way or another. And so we're going to look at this box frame for an example. And here we're looking at the St. Augustine's allegory, stealing the pear. And so this is an example of how for main ideas we list the main themes in the allegory and explanations for those themes and how that ties in with the allegory. Another major area is how the plot unfolds or is propelled. And so, for an example, one of those standards is analyze how complex characters, those with multiple conflicting motivations, develop over the course of the text and interact with other characters and advance the plot or develop the theme. Now, when you look at a standard like this, this is obviously not just one standard, but actually there are multiple ones sort of folded into one statement. And so sometimes it's very difficult to address all of these at one time. And so there are some tools that you can use that sort of break that up. And so I'm going to click on Story, Grammar, and Sequence here under Literature. Now, obviously, these are some little kid ones. So I'm going to click on page 2 of those, and that takes me to some slightly more advanced ones. And one of the ones you might look at is the 4-step sequence. And we're going to look at that in terms of how a story's plot unfolds and so forth. So one of the ways of doing this is you basically have what's the first major event in the story and the details associated with it. What's another major that led to this event, that led to this event, and so forth. And so you can organize the supporting points under each of those details accordingly. Likewise, you can take a character and look at how the character responded to events in the story. So for an example, in event number 1, you'd list the gist of the event and then ways a particular character responded to that event. And then as the other events unfold, and you can keep tracing how that particular character responded to it. Now, one of the things that you can do and to make this more interactive with kids, for example, is you can take several different characters from a story and divide the class into groups. And each group takes one of those characters. And so you identify the major events. And so each group is actually dealing with the same set of events, but each group is dealing with a different character and how that particular character responded to each event. And so you can have them discuss, develop the smart sheet accordingly, and then later share with the class what they came up with. It's a great way to get everybody involved in interacting about the story. Another tool you can use under the area of cause and effect, since we're talking about how characters respond to change, that's essentially a cause and effect type thing. And so one of the ones you can use is this when then. And so here's how that looks. You have a character is about, and so this is more sort of drilling down on a particular instance. So when this happened, and then what were the details of what happened. Then what did the character do, or how did the character respond, and what were the details associated with that. When we look at how text structure contributes to meaning, for an example, analyze how an author's choices concerning how to structure text, order events, and within it, like parallel plots or manipulate time, like flashbacks, and create such effects as mystery, tension, or surprise. And again, this is one of those standards that's actually got a lot going on with it, and so we're going to break these up a little bit and show you how I can address different elements in these standards. So for an example, let's start with looking at parallel plots. Since we're talking about parallel plots, we're essentially doing a type of compare and contrast. And so that particular tool, that kind of tool, will be really helpful. So up here under compare and contrast, I'm going to click on matrix simple. And so these open up, and then what I'm going to do is select this first one, which is called a 2x3, which means we're comparing two things across 3 dimensions. And let me share with you how I would set that up to address parallel plots. So for an example, let's say we're doing Great Gatsby, and one of those subplots was Gatsby's search for significance, and a parallel subplot number 2 was Nick Carraway's search for the meaning in life. And so the dimensions of comparison might be how the subplot is introduced, factors that propel the subplot, and what was the subplot's resolution, and then so what at the bottom. And this simple kind of setting up this matrix like this makes that, how do you address these parallel subplots, much more clear to students as you're working through these. Another is how the author manipulates time in the use of flashbacks. So let me illustrate how I might address that. Again, I'm going to use a compare and contrast, and this time I'm going to use a 3x3 matrix, which means I'm comparing 3 things across 3 dimensions. And an example of that, again, we'll use the Gatsby and the flashbacks in it. And so one is when Jordan tells Nick how and when she first met Gatsby on page 79. And when Nick explains how Gatsby got his name and what his childhood was like. And then when Nick explains what happened when Gatsby returned from the war. So those are the 3 flashbacks. And so what I'll be comparing is the point in the story when the flashback happens and what's revealed in that particular flashback and how that flashback propels the plot. So you can see how this makes that whole process a lot more structured and doable as you're analyzing books like Gatsby. Another area is addressing tension, and so you can also use cause and effect for that, and clicked on cause and effect webs this time. And so one of the things that you can, there are many here, but I'm just going to illustrate the one called interaction results. And so this one is what happens when this, or this person or character, interacts with this or this character, and what those interactions lead to in terms of the gist of what happens, and then specific things. So for an example, with Julius Caesar, having defeated Pompey, is celebrated as a hero in Rome, and is offered the king's crown. Okay, so the interactions is Julius Caesar, having defeated Pompey, is celebrated, is offered the crown, and in the meantime you have a group of Romans that are really fearful of the power and ambition of Caesar, decide to assassinate him. So what happens when those two things come together? And so of course Caesar's killed, and then all the various spin-off things that happen as a result of that tension between the two. You can also use a simple matrix in terms of how a sentence, chapter, scene, or stanza fits into the overall structure. And an example of that is using Romeo and Juliet. And so we'll take sentences, scenes, or stanzas, and what those mean in plain English, and then what's the connection of that to the actual plot. So for an example, we'll take very specific quotes from Romeo and Juliet, interpret those in terms of what they mean in English, and then what's the connection to the plot. In terms of point of view, analyze a particular point of view or cultural experience reflected in a work of literature. We can also use a simple matrix for that, again using Romeo and Juliet as example. What we're going to look at is how people perceive this in Shakespeare's day versus how the same thing is perceived in today's world. And so these are examples of the kinds of things that we might consider in terms of how the point of views change. Likewise, what we can do is actually set this up so that you have different characters in the story and a couple of important events in the story, and how each character views each event differently than the other characters do. So I'm just going to skip through this part, go on to the next thing. And now what we're going to look at is comparing conveyances of a story or poem. So for example, analyze the representation of a subject or a key scene in two different artistic mediums, including which is emphasized or absent in each treatment, and so forth. So this looks pretty scary when you first look at it, but there's a way of dealing with that. Since we're doing comparing something, I'm going to go straight to compare and contrast. And this time I'm picking compare matrix with conclusions. So to get here, we'll click on this one, 2x4 conclusions. And so we're comparing this with the actual painting of it, of the event. And so I have these different dimensions that we'll look at in terms of how these are portrayed here and how these are portrayed in the painting. And then what would you conclude about each of these? Also comparing genres, like how an author draws on or transforms source material from a specific work. And so here's an example of that, drawn on specific genres. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here to the hierarchic 4 main ideas as an example of that. And I'm going to use this box frame and give you an example of how that can be set up. And so for an example, let's say we're focusing on The Tempest, and it's basically about, this whole thing is about how Shakespeare transformed biblical themes in The Tempest. And so there's the image of God, fallen man in exile. God manipulates the world to see how others react, and God punishes and forgives. So typically what I will do is I won't allow, not so much allow, but the chances are pretty good that students are going to struggle coming up with what these themes are, unless you're dealing with students that are really bright. But your everyday typical student is going to struggle coming up with these themes. So I'm going to provide the themes, and then as we're reading The Tempest, we'll analyze what are ways that these themes from the Bible show up in The Tempest. And so as we're working through it, then we'll take notes about each as the story unfolds. So far I've just been giving you kind of an overview of different ways of using various tools from the toolkit, Make Sense Strategies toolkit, as applied to some of those specific reading standards. What we're going to focus on next is some of the writing standards associated with the Common Core for 912 and ways to use some of the tools from Make Sense to address those writing standards.